The wind howled across the desolate plains of Vargos, carrying with it the scent of decay and the distant echo of storms rolling across the mountains. It was a planet long abandoned, deemed uninhabitable by the Galactic Conservation Unit, its surface scarred by centuries of war and neglect. No one came here willingly. And yet, Dr. Cassia Holt stood in the valley, her boots crunching against the brittle soil as her handheld scanner emitted a slow, pulsing rhythm. Life. Not just any life. Something massive. Something ancient. Cassia tightened her grip on the scanner, adjusting the settings. This wasn't right. The reports had been clear. Vargos was dead. Whatever was down in that ravine shouldn't exist. She took a cautious step forward, peering over the edge of the rocky cliffside. That's when she saw him. A colossal wolf, half buried in the valley floor, his fur matted with grime, his once powerful limbs shackled by dark, pulsating barnacles that glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. His breathing was labored, shallow. But he was alive. Cassia's breath caught in her throat. She had seen a lot in her time as a frontier medic. Wounded creatures on dying worlds, forgotten species left to rot in the wake of war. But never had she encountered anything like this. This wasn't just a beast. This was a king. Even in his weakened state, there was no mistaking the regal presence that clung to him like a second skin. His massive form, now battered and broken, had once stood tall. His coat, once silver as stardust, now dulled by suffering. His ears, twitching weakly at the sound of her approach, once held high in authority, now weighed down by unseen burdens. Cassia swallowed, her instincts screaming at her to run, to turn away from this impossible discovery. But she didn't move, because his eyes, even through the haze of pain and exhaustion, found hers. They were sharp, intelligent, filled with a sorrow that no mere animal could comprehend. She knelt down slowly, setting her scanner aside, pressing her palm against the cold, cracked earth. "You're not supposed to be here," she murmured. A low growl rumbled from deep within the wolf's chest. Not one of threat, but of warning. Cassia's heart pounded, but she stayed still. She wasn't afraid. Something in those silver eyes told her that this wasn't just a creature left to die. This was a betrayal, and she needed to know why. The wolf exhaled, a long, slow breath that rattled in his throat. His body remained still, but his gaze never wavered. Cassia watched the rise and fall of his ribs, the way his claws twitched against the dirt, the sluggish pulse of light from the barnacles that latched onto his body. Whatever these things were, they weren't natural. She reached for her med scanner, fingers steady despite the tension tightening in her chest. The device flickered to life, humming as it mapped the parasitic infestation. Her stomach dropped. The barnacles weren't just draining him. They were feeding on something deeper, something beyond just muscle and blood. Energy. Life force. Cassia's breath came sharp as she studied the readouts. This wasn't a natural affliction. Someone had done this to him. Someone had designed these things to break him. She looked back up, feeling the weight of those silver eyes on her again. "You can understand me, can't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The wolf's ears flicked slightly, his gaze sharp as ever. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I am Atreus," he rasped, "last of the starborn kin." Cassia froze, the words slamming into her like a physical force. A talking wolf, a king. A creature from legends whispered across the stars, Atreus. She had heard the name before. Stories passed down in the old records. Tales of the starborn kin, celestial wolves who once roamed the great cosmic trails guarding the hidden paths between worlds. But they had vanished. Extinct. Or so she had been told. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but none of it mattered as much as the pain in his voice. She shifted closer, keeping her movements slow. "What happened to you?" Atreus let out a deep, shuddering breath. "Betrayal." Cassia clenched her jaw. She had suspected as much. "My own counsel," Atreus continued, his voice quieter now, weighed down by exhaustion. "They feared me. Feared what I would become, what my kind would become." His silver eyes darkened. "They did not kill me outright. No, they wanted me to suffer, to fade." Cassia looked at the parasitic growths again, anger curling in her gut. This wasn't a disease, it was a sentence, a slow, painful death, ensuring that even if he somehow survived, he would never rise again. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her short, dust-streaked hair. "They left you here to die." Atreus's head tilted slightly, as if considering her words. "Yes." Cassia tightened her grip on the scanner. "Well," she muttered, determination solidifying in her bones, "they're going to be disappointed." Atreus blinked, something faintly resembling amusement flickering in his tired gaze. "You are bold, human," he murmured. Cassia pulled out her medkit, flipping through the vials of antiseptics and stabilizers. "You don't know the half of it," she said, before meeting his gaze again. "I'm getting these things off you." Atreus was silent for a moment, his silver eyes watching her with something unreadable. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a sign of trust. Cassia didn't waste another second. She activated her surgical tools, ignoring the growing ache in her chest. He had been left here to die. But as long as she was breathing, she wouldn't let that happen. Cassia knelt beside Atreus, her medical scanner emitting a soft, rhythmic hum as it continued mapping the extent of the infestation. The barnacles, grotesque and pulsating, had embedded themselves deep into his flesh, their tendrils snaking beneath the surface in ways that made her stomach tighten. This was no natural affliction. These things had been designed to break him. Her fingers hovered over the largest growth, watching as the parasitic organism flared in response to her touch, a sickly blue pulse rippling across its surface. It was like it could sense her. Atreus let out a slow breath, his body rigid beneath the weight of his suffering. "These creatures," he murmured, his voice strained but steady, "are not of this world. They were bred in laboratories of the Dominion, engineered to devour what they cannot control." His silver eyes flickered toward her. "They are drawn to power, to energy. The more I resisted, the stronger their hold became." Cassia's grip on her medkit tightened. The implications of that were terrifying. The barnacles weren't just parasites, they were a weapon. "Then we have to get them off," she said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Now." Atreus exhaled, a sound that rumbled through his colossal frame. "It will not be easy. They are fused to my essence, their tendrils run deep." "I don't care," Cassia shot back, pulling a sterilized scalpel from her pack and activating its vibro edge. The blade hummed softly, sharp enough to cut through reinforced alloy. "I've taken shrapnel out of soldier spinal columns with my bare hands. I can handle this." A ghost of amusement flickered across Atreus's tired eyes, but it was quickly replaced by understanding. He had no choice but to trust her now. Cassia positioned herself at the first sight, choosing a barnacle latched onto his shoulder blade. The scanner displayed its tendrils weaving beneath his muscle fibers, leaching his bioelectric energy in an endless, merciless cycle. She adjusted the surgical settings, calibrating the laser scalpel for precision work. Her pulse steadied. She made the first cut. The barnacle reacted violently. The moment the scalpel touched its surface, it lashed out, its tendrils flaring like burning wires, sending a shockwave through Atreus's body. The great wolf snarled in agony, his muscles seizing as the barnacle tried to tighten its grip. Cassia didn't stop. She pressed the scalpel deeper, cutting away the outer shell, exposing the blackened tendrils coiled inside him, like veins of corruption. Sweat slicked her brow as she gripped a pair of extraction clamps, her fingers steady as she carefully severed the barnacle's root structure. Atreus growled, the sound vibrating through the air. "Faster," he gritted out. Cassia yanked the first parasite free. It let out a shriek, a soundless, wretched noise that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of reality before crumbling into dust in her hands. Atreus shuddered, his massive form trembling. Cassia barely had a second to breathe before she moved to the next one. For hours, she worked. Each removal was more violent than the last, the barnacles fighting back as they were torn from their host. Some sent jolts of energy ripping through Atreus's body, forcing Cassia to manually override his nervous system with stabilizing injectors. Others tried to regrow, their tendrils latching desperately onto his flesh, even as she burned them away with sterilization lasers. It was an endless battle, and then, finally, only one remained. The largest, most insidious one, nestled at the base of Atreus's skull. Cassia's hands ached, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but she wasn't about to stop now. She exhaled sharply, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Atreus," she said, voice low, steady. "This last one is different." The Wolf King's silver eyes flickered open, locking onto hers. "I know," he murmured. Cassia took a slow breath. "It's connected to your core nervous system. If I don't remove it correctly, it could kill me," Atreus finished. Silence stretched between them. Then he tilted his head forward. "Do it." Cassia swallowed hard and cut. The moment the scalpel touched the final barnacle, the world ignited. The parasite lashed out violently, its tendrils surging with raw, unstable energy, sending a shockwave across the valley. Cassia was thrown back, her body slamming against the cold, jagged ground as Atreus let out a deafening snarl, his form shuddering beneath the force of the barnacle's final stand. It was fighting her, fighting to keep its hold. Cassia cursed, pushing herself up, ignoring the pain in her ribs as she scrambled forward. Atreus's body was convulsing, his claws gouging the earth beneath him as the parasite pumped energy directly into his spinal cord, trying to overwrite his will completely. She had seconds, not minutes, seconds. With a surge of adrenaline, Cassia lunged forward, grabbing the barnacle with both hands, her gloves burning from the energy it emitted. It felt like holding on to a live wire, her body screaming in protest as she ripped her scalpel through the final tendril, severing its grip completely. The barnacle let out an unearthly wail, a sound that should not have existed, a sound that reverberated through time itself, before it withered into nothing, dissolving in a flash of cold, empty light. And then, silence. The storm had passed. Atreus's body collapsed, his massive form still and unmoving, the weight of centuries of torment suddenly gone. Cassia's breath hitched. No. She scrambled toward him, pressing her scanner against his throat, searching for life signs, searching for anything. The screen flickered. One beat. Then another. Then, a slow, shuddering inhale. Atreus's chest rose, his silver eyes fluttering open, glowing now with a light that had not been there before. The chains that had bound him for so long were broken. Cassia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand still pressed against his fur, feeling the slow, steady pulse beneath his skin. He was alive. Atreus shifted, testing the weight of his body, stretching limbs that had been ensnared for too long. He tilted his head toward her, studying her in a way that felt different now. "You did it," he murmured. Cassia huffed out a weak, tired laugh. "Damn right I did." A beat of silence. Then Atreus bowed his head. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the meaning was unmistakable. A gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, of a bond that had been forged through fire and pain. Cassia swallowed hard, something thick and unspoken lodging itself in her throat. Atreus exhaled, his silver eyes burning now, renewed, unchained. And for the first time in centuries, the Wolf King stood. Atreus rose to his feet, shaking off the last remnants of his suffering like a storm shedding rain. Dust and debris scattered from his fur, and for the first time since she had found him, Cassia saw him as he was meant to be, not a dying remnant of a forgotten kingdom, but a Wolf King reborn. The sheer size of him was staggering. Even at full height, Cassia barely reached his shoulder, and when his head lifted, his ears brushing the swirling remnants of mist in the valley, it became obvious why his people had feared him enough to betray him. His silver coat shimmered, no longer dull and lifeless, but woven with the stardust of his celestial lineage. His massive claws, once buried in dirt and weighed down by decay, flexed against the ground, the strength returning to them. The barnacles were gone, but the scars they left behind glowed faintly, evidence of his torment, evidence of his survival. Cassia should have felt relieved, should have let herself collapse from exhaustion after hours of fighting to free him. But something wasn't right. The air had changed. She could feel it, an unnatural shift in the atmosphere, like the planet itself had been holding its breath and was only now exhaling. The wind had died down. The valley was too quiet. Atreus lifted his head, his ears flicking, nostrils flaring as he took in the silence. Then, without a word, his silver eyes locked onto hers, sharp and alert. "We are not alone," he murmured. Cassia barely had time to respond before the sky split apart. A thunderous hum vibrated through the valley, low and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of some ancient beast stirring from slumber. Cassia turned sharply, shielding her eyes as a ship descended from the thick clouds above, its massive silhouette blocking out the twin moons. Not just any ship. A Dominion warship. Her stomach twisted. They had been watching. Atreus bared his teeth, a low, primal growl rumbling through his chest. "They come to finish what they started," he said. Cassia cursed under her breath. If the Dominion had sent a warship, it meant one thing. They had known Atreus was alive. They had been waiting, watching, ensuring that their curse held strong. Now that she had broken it, they were here to erase their mistake. Cassia glanced up as the ship's engines roared, its landing gear extending as it settled in the valley before them. The hull gleamed, dark as obsidian, adorned with the sigil of the High Dominion Council. A ramp descended. Figures emerged, their silhouettes framed by the blinding artificial lights pouring from the warship's interior. Elite soldiers clad in reflective high-tech armor, their visors glowing with a cold blue light. Weapons primed. Then, from their ranks, one stepped forward. Tall, commanding. His robes were sleek, embroidered with the silver insignia of the Starborn Order, a stark contrast to the ruthless, calculated edge of his mechanical gauntlets. Cassia's fingers twitched toward her sidearm. She knew who he was before he even spoke. Lord Regent Svaran, the man who had orchestrated Atreus's fall. Atreus stood frozen, his gaze locked on the regent, his body coiled with tension, not fear, rage. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Svaran smiled, his voice smooth like oil over water. "So," he said, eyes glinting, "the wolf still breathes." The words hung in the air like a blade suspended between them. Cassia felt the weight behind them, the cruel amusement woven into the regent's tone. Atreus didn't respond immediately. He simply stared, his silver eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, his lips curled back, revealing canines as sharp as daggers. "I see you still hide behind metal and soldiers, Svaran," Atreus said, his voice quiet, controlled, but carrying the weight of a storm about to break. Svaran's smile never wavered. "You mistake prudence for cowardice," he replied smoothly. "And yet, here you are, the last of your kind, standing in the dirt, a relic that should have died centuries ago." Cassia clenched her jaw, her fingers twitching at her holster. "He's standing, though," she cut in, her voice hard, "which is more than I can say for whatever failed plan you had to keep him buried here." Svaran's gaze flicked to her for the first time, his lips curling in amusement. "And what are you, human?" he asked. "A scavenger? A fool who thinks herself a savior? You have no idea what you've done." Cassia tilted her head slightly, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "You're right about one thing," she said. "I don't know why you betrayed your own king, but I know you wouldn't be here if you weren't afraid of what happens next." Svaran's expression sharpened. Behind him, his soldiers shifted, their fingers tightening around their weapons. Atreus let out a low, menacing growl, stepping forward, closer. "You tried to kill me." The Wolf King murmured, his voice almost gentle, though it sent shivers down Cassia's spine. Svaran didn't move, but there was something, a flicker of unease in his posture. "You will not live long enough to reclaim what was lost," the regent finally said. "The Dominion will see to that." Atreus chuckled darkly, the sound rumbling through the valley like distant thunder. "I am not here to reclaim the past," he said. "I am here to end you." The air shifted, the soldiers moved, and then all hell broke loose. Atreus lunged. Cassia dove for cover as the first plasma rounds exploded against the rocks, sending debris flying. Atreus tore through the first wave of soldiers, his claws slicing through armor like it was paper, a force of nature unleashed. Svaran stumbled back, eyes widening in real-time horror as Atreus closed the distance between them, moving faster than a being his size had any right to move. Cassia rolled, pulling her blaster and firing at the nearest soldier, the shot slamming into his visor and sending him crashing backward. Svaran turned, barking orders, retreat, regroup, fire at will, but it was too late. Atreus was already upon him. Cassia saw the moment Svaran realized he had lost. Atreus's claws slammed into the ground beside him, sending a shockwave rippling through the battlefield, the force alone enough to send Svaran sprawling. For the first time, true fear crossed the regent's face. Atreus loomed over him, his silver eyes glowing with something primal. "You took my throne," he murmured. "You took my people. You took my very name from history." Svaran's breath hitched. "But you never took my vengeance." Cassia saw the muscles in Atreus's legs tense, the moment before the kill. She exhaled sharply. "Atreus, stop." The words left her lips before she even thought them through, and somehow, impossibly, he did. Atreus froze, his breath ragged, his claws still curled inches from Svaran's throat. Cassia stood slowly, holstering her weapon. "This isn't how you win," she said softly. For a long, excruciating moment, Atreus did not move. Then, slowly, he stepped back. And Svaran knew he had lost. Atreus stepped back, his silver eyes burning as he gazed down at the fallen regent. His muscles were still coiled, his claws still stained with the blood of Dominion soldiers, but for the first time since the battle began, he hesitated. The hunger for vengeance that had carried him through centuries of suffering now stood at the edge of fulfillment. Yet something held him in place. Cassia's words echoed in his mind. "This isn't how you win." The wind howled through the valley, carrying the scent of fire and plasma. The remnants of the battle still flickered in the background. Dominion soldiers lay sprawled, some dead, some barely alive, their weapons crushed beneath Atreus's fury. The warship in the sky, once a vessel of oppression, now hovered uncertainly, its commander watching in stunned silence, unsure whether to engage or retreat. Svaran coughed, a smear of blood trailing from his lips as he pushed himself onto one elbow. His breath was ragged, but the flicker of arrogance had not left his expression. He looked up at Atreus, and despite his injuries, despite the destruction around him, he still smirked. "Go ahead," the regent rasped. "Finish it." Atreus did not move. His claws twitched, the part of him still burning with rage demanding retribution. But something about the way Svaran spoke, the way he waited, it set Cassia's instincts on edge. "Atreus," she called, stepping forward cautiously. "Something's wrong." The Wolf King barely flicked an ear in her direction, his focus still locked on the man who had orchestrated his downfall. Svaran exhaled slowly, as if amused. "You should listen to your human," he murmured. "She's perceptive." Then, he reached into his coat. Cassia reacted before she even thought, her instincts honed from years of survival on the frontier. She lunged forward, tackling Atreus's leg just as Svaran's hand flicked up, something small and metallic clutched between his fingers. A pulse of violet energy exploded outward. Atreus roared in pain, his body racked with violent convulsions, his legs buckling beneath him. Cassia hit the ground hard, rolling as a second pulse erupted from the device, filling the air with a piercing hum. She recognized it immediately, a subsonic disruptor designed specifically to target creatures with bioelectric signatures like Atreus. It wasn't meant to kill him. It was meant to incapacitate, to chain him again. "No!" Cassia screamed, reaching for her weapon. But Svaran was already moving, his soldiers, the few still standing, reactivating their rifles, their blue visors flaring to life as they closed in on Atreus's weakened form. Cassia scrambled to her feet, aiming for the disruptor, her blaster firing off a single desperate shot. Too late. Svaran activated the device's full charge, and Atreus's body collapsed. The Wolf King fell, his massive form hitting the dirt with a sickening finality, his breath ragged, his limbs twitching uselessly against the force holding him down. The valley was silent. Svaran straightened, brushing dust from his coat, the disruptor's glow fading as he tucked it away. "Did you think I wouldn't prepare for this?" he mused, his voice infuriatingly calm. Cassia felt something deep and cold settle in her chest. He had never intended to kill Atreus. He had always planned to take him back alive. Atreus couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, every nerve burning from the disruptor's pulse. He could feel the energy coiling around him, sinking into his bones, dragging him back into the abyss of helplessness he had barely escaped. Not again. Not like this. Svaran stepped closer, his expression that of a man who knew he had already won. "You don't understand, do you?" he murmured, his tone almost pitying. "I never needed to kill you, Atreus. I only needed to prove a point." Atreus's breathing was ragged, his vision swimming as Svaran crouched beside him, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You were a god once, a king. Now look at you." His fingers ghosted over the still healing scars where the barnacles had once taken root. "You let a human take pity on you. You let her think she had saved you, but all she did was deliver you back into my hands." Atreus growled, low and broken, his teeth bared. "Ah, there it is," Svaran smirked. "The fire's still there, isn't it? Good. You'll need it." He stood, turning to his remaining men. "Secure him. We leave at once." Cassia moved before they could. She grabbed her blaster and fired 3 quick shots, aiming not for Svaran, but for the ground just behind him. The blasts exploded on impact, sending up a cloud of dust and fire, forcing the soldiers to stumble back. She didn't hesitate. She ran. Not away. Toward Atreus. She slid to her knees beside him, fingers digging into the thick fur of his neck, searching for any sign that he could fight. "Atreus," she breathed, "look at me." His silver eyes flickered open, barely focused, but aware. "We're not done yet," she murmured. Svaran's voice snapped through the haze. "Stop her." Cassia grabbed her last injector, the strongest stimulant she had. A risk, a gamble, but it was the only choice. She pressed the vial against Atreus's neck and triggered the release. For a moment, nothing happened. Then everything did. Atreus's pulse surged, his muscles convulsing, not in pain, but in resurgence. The bioelectric energy that had been suppressed by the disruptor suddenly ignited, a wave of raw power snapping through his body like a star being reborn. The Dominion soldiers froze, their weapons raised, their eyes widening in real-time horror as Atreus began to rise. Svaran took a single step back. "Impossible," he whispered. Atreus's fur flared with light, the ancient celestial power of the starborn kin coursing through him once more. The disruptor's hold shattered like glass, its energy disintegrating in the wake of something far older, far greater. And then, the Wolf King spoke. "You," Atreus growled, his voice no longer weak, no longer fading, but thunderous, unchained, unrelenting. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." The ground trembled beneath them. Svaran's face twisted in fury as he shouted, "Fire!" The final battle had begun. The valley erupted in fire and fury. Svaran's command cracked through the air like a gunshot, and the remaining Dominion soldiers didn't hesitate. Plasma bolts streaked across the battlefield, cutting through the dust-choked night like furious comets. Each shot aimed to break Atreus before he could rise again. But the Wolf King was already moving. Cassia barely had time to scramble backward as Atreus lunged, his celestial form surging with raw energy, his silver fur now alight with an unearthly glow. The first soldier that stood in his way barely had time to scream before Atreus's claws tore through his armor like it was paper, sending the Dominion warrior flying with a sickening crunch. A second soldier turned, aiming his rifle at point-blank range, but Atreus snapped his jaws shut around the barrel, wrenching it away with a savage twist. The rifle exploded in a burst of superheated gas, but the wolf did not slow down. He sprinted through the chaos, moving faster than the Dominion could track, his body a silver blur against the flames rising in the valley. Cassia rolled behind a fallen soldier's corpse, yanking his weapon free. Just as Svaran stepped forward, the disruptor still clutched in his hand. His calm had cracked. The regent's eyes burned with rage as he watched his plan unravel before him, his fingers tightening around the device that had once ensured Atreus's helplessness. Cassia knew what he was thinking before he even moved. She fired first. The shot ripped through the disruptor, shattering the device in a shower of sparks and burning circuitry before Svaran could activate it again. The regent stumbled backward, his face twisted in shock as the useless remains of his last safeguard clattered to the dirt at his feet. "You," he seethed, turning his glare to Cassia. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," she shot back. Svaran lunged, drawing a sleek blade from his belt, its edge glowing with a dark, pulsating light, a monomolecular weapon designed to cut through anything. He moved with deadly precision, his strike aimed at her throat. Cassia dodged. Barely. The blade whistled past her skin, slicing through the edge of her jacket before she twisted away, leveling the rifle at his chest. She pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The charge was dead. Svaran smirked, seeing the failure in her eyes, and pivoted for another strike, but he never got the chance. Atreus collided with him like a falling star. The impact sent Svaran slamming into the valley floor, the ground shaking beneath them as the Wolf King stood over his enemy once more. Atreus's breath came in heavy, deliberate exhales, his silver eyes burning with something ancient, something absolute. And for the first time in his life, Svaran looked afraid. "You have spent centuries hunting me," Atreus growled, his voice as deep and endless as the void itself. "You caged me. You tried to erase my name from history." Svaran clenched his jaw, eyes flicking toward his remaining soldiers, but none of them moved. They would not save him. Atreus leaned closer, his fangs glinting in the flickering firelight. "You failed." With a single powerful motion, Atreus's massive paws slammed into Svaran's chest, pinning the regent down. The man gasped, his bones groaning beneath the weight of the celestial wolf's strength. Cassia stepped closer, watching as Atreus held Svaran's life in his claws. "You would be justified in killing him," she said quietly. Atreus's gaze flickered toward her. He knew that. He had been waiting for this moment for centuries, but instead he looked back down at his enemy, his expression unreadable. "You once believed that power was enough to make you a king," Atreus murmured. "But power without honor is just a weapon waiting to break." He lifted his paw. Svaran choked in disbelief, his breath ragged as he stared up at the creature he had tried so hard to destroy. "You are not worth my vengeance," Atreus said. "You are not worth remembering." The words cut deeper than any wound ever could. Svaran scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage, his pride shattered beyond repair. He turned, staggering away, knowing there was nothing left for him here. His Dominion soldiers, those that had survived, watched him go with blank stares. No one followed. Svaran had lost. Not just this battle, everything. The fires in the valley smoldered, their embers floating up toward the starlit sky like the last remnants of an old war finally burning away. Atreus stood in the center of it all, his silver coat illuminated by the celestial glow of his renewed power. The weight of centuries lifted from his shoulders. Cassia watched him, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. "It's over," she murmured. Atreus turned his gaze to her, a small flicker of something wry in his expression. "Not yet," he said. "Not until the Dominion understands what has happened here." Cassia frowned. "They'll come for you again." "I know," Atreus replied, "and this time I will not be in chains when they arrive." He turned his head to the sky, where the Dominion warship still hovered in the distance, the crew inside likely watching everything unfold. Cassia stepped beside him, her fingers still wrapped tightly around her blaster. "So, what now?" Atreus tilted his head, thoughtful. "You saved me, Cassia Holt. You gave me a choice when I had none left." "You saved yourself," she corrected. Atreus huffed, a sound that might have been a chuckle. "Then let me return the favor," he said. "Come with me." Cassia blinked, taken off guard. "What?" "The Dominion will return," Atreus explained, his silver eyes flickering in the dim light. "They will seek to finish what they started, but I will not be a lone king standing against an empire." His gaze settled on her. "You are not just a medic," he said. "You are a warrior, whether you see it or not, and I would have you stand at my side." Cassia let out a slow breath. She had spent her life on the fringes, saving those that the galaxy had left behind. She had never thought herself a leader. She had never imagined herself standing beside a king reborn. But looking at Atreus now, at the unshackled power in his form, at the future they had just stolen back from the brink of oblivion, she realized something deep in her bones. She was already part of this story. She had been since the moment she knelt beside him in the dirt and said, "I'm getting these things off you." A slow smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "All right then," she murmured. "Let's make history." Atreus let out a low, contented growl, his celestial energy pulsing one last time as he turned his head to the stars. The Wolf King had returned, and the galaxy would never be the same again.